And so Allen Lazard had like a 20% target share last year per game. Now he's in New York with him. He follows Aaron Rodgers to New York or vice versa. And he's getting pumped up as the team's wide receiver 2 in fantasy. But I think that you could easily make the argument that Corey Davis is a better wide receiver than Allen Lazard, and that he could end up being on the field in 2 wide receiver sets.
Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host, and on this episode, I'm thrilled to have JJ Zachariason on the show. He is the founder of Late Round Football, and he is a fantasy football and football modeling expert. In this episode, JJ tells us about his model for season-long NFL stats, and he also gives us some bets based on this model. He tells us about how he broke into the fantasy football space with the advice that you should draft your quarterback in later rounds, hence late round, but he tells us about how that advice has changed. And finally, we cover a wide assortment of teams and players, which includes George Kittle, Lamar Jackson, the Atlanta Falcons, and the Chicago Bears. The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Ranks Sports Betting Newsletter. This is a free service that strives to be 3 things. 1, valuable. 2, concise. 3, entertaining. Every Saturday, I send out my curated list of sports betting tips and analytics. As we move into August, you'll get my 10-part preview series for the 2023 football season. To get this free service, go to thepowerrank.com. That is my site for better sports betting information through data and analytics. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com. Joining me in this episode of the Football Analytics Show is JJ Zachariason. He is the founder of Late Round Football, and he is a fantasy football expert. He won Best Football Publication of 2022 from the Fantasy Sports Writers Association for his draft guide, and I'm very excited to talk to him about the 2023 version. JJ, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. Always great to talk to you.
JJ, so let's just start and talk a little bit about how your preseason model works. Like, how do you go about projecting players and their stats for the 2023 season?
Yeah, so, being in the fantasy space, the offensive players, the offensive skill players are very, very important. So you're looking at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Those are the players that we're drafting. So I'm building projections for each of those guys. Now, I will say, I'm not drafting off of the projections straight up. I think it's important to have that understanding because there's so much variance that's involved with this stuff. It's just good to have sort of a baseline and a high level understanding of the direction that these guys can go in and like what the depth charts look like and all that kind of stuff. So when I'm building out projections, it's really for me to see the greater landscape, at a better level. But the way that I sort of do this is I start at the team level and then I go down into the individual player level. So at the team level, I'm projecting out total pass attempts per team, total rush attempts per team, total touchdowns based on some regression models. And then I adjust that sort of subjectively based on the coaching changes, etc. And you can adjust pass rate and such based on what we've seen historically from certain coaches. A guy like Greg Roman, who I'm sure we'll talk about later, versus a guy like Todd Monken, who's coming into Baltimore. A more pass-heavy approach historically over expectation. And so you can sort of adjust subjectively a little bit that way. There's a lot of subjectivity involved in general. I think that a lot of people believe that you're just kind of hitting a button and everything just kind of generates, which, there are things that are automatically generating, of course, but there's still subjectivity involved because once I get those team level numbers, I'm then projecting quarterback numbers. And that's just based on, historical stuff and regression analysis. And then from that, I then have these quarterback lines and then I can sort of split that up at running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And when you're doing it with those positions, running back, wide receiver, and tight end, you're not saying like, oh, this team has 650 pass attempts. Therefore, this wide receiver had 100 targets last year. He'll have 80 targets this year. It's not like that. It's more so looking at things like backfield share and market share numbers. So target share is a very, very important metric because that's far, far stickier year over year because obviously team dynamics change. One team might be really pass heavy one year and then projected to be a lot less pass heavy the next season. And in that instance, you want to be flexible with that and using target share numbers. So like if a player has a 20%, 21% target share versus their previous season total raw volume, it's just important to sort of designate the difference between those two. So a lot of the player driven stuff is based on market share numbers. So target share, rush share, running back, and then obviously target share for running back as well. And then there's just some very basic yards to touchdown type models that I've created that once I get a yardage number, I can then adjust that for how many touchdowns that player might score. And then there's things that are inputted like average depth of target, just to know where these guys are getting their targets. And obviously, you can boost someone up based on their projected red zone usage and stuff too. Like I said, there's some subjectivity involved. There's also a lot of math involved. But overall, you then get a nice clean stat line for each player.
Awesome. I'm very interested in kind of the mixture of science and art that you do with this, because I think anything, whether you're doing fantasy, whether you're betting on sports, it's never just one or the other. I think you need both. So I don't want to ask you too much about your model, but maybe you could give us a sense for what where the art comes in, and then maybe more where the math comes in. Like I would presume with target share, which is something I'm really interested in, like that's more math because you said it is persistent from season to season. But maybe you can give us a sense for where is the math and where is the art?
Yeah, I think that the art is more so in your general player analysis and on that side of things. So, I have a prospect model that helps me project how well these running backs and wide receivers and now tight ends too are going to do as they enter the NFL. So through their first 3 years in the league. And then once they've played in the NFL for 3 years, you have a general idea of how good or bad these players are, right? You're going to get late career breakout, sure, but generally speaking, if a player is good right away, he's then good later on in his career and vice versa. And so, I've done this long enough where you sort of bucket players into these different, if you want to focus on target share here, like elite players, these elite wide receivers like Justin Jefferson and like Odell Beckham back in the day. And, these very, very good, strong wideouts, they're going to likely see at least a 25% target share in their offense because that's what we've seen historically. And then, the next level down, maybe in that 20% to 25% range, you get very, very good wide receivers, but maybe they have pretty good competition on their team, objectively good competition and talent on their team, or maybe they're just not necessarily, at that elite level where we can lock them into that 25% target share. And so you sort of just bucket players out that way. And then you're looking again at the rest of the team. One of the things that's very, very popular, if you will, within the fantasy space is what's called vacated targets. Okay. And so vacated targets are essentially, this team, let's say the Rams, they had all of these pass catchers last year, and here are the pass catchers that left that team. And now those are the vacated targets left on the Rams team. So if the Rams add players, they draft a guy like Puka Nacua this past year, who's getting a lot of run. They lose Allen Robinson this past year. Then a lot of people will sort of fit and say, oh, Puka Nacua can take this many targets from Allen Robinson and et cetera, et cetera. But the way that I think of it, instead of thinking about it, and this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, but instead of thinking about it in terms of like raw targets, think about it in terms of target share, because every team is always going to have a 100% target share. It doesn't change. And so, the narrative of too many mouths to feed, if you will, it does and doesn't exist at the same time, because good players earn targets, right? If you're Justin Jefferson, you're going to see at least a 25% target share in your offense as long as you're healthy or as long as you have competent coaching, right? But if you have a team, hypothetically, with Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Garrett Wilson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, all these just stud wide receivers, something's got to give eventually, because you can only have a 100% target share. So I think the art sort of comes in the form of player analysis and knowing who those elite guys just generally are based on their career trajectory, how they were as prospects entering the league. And then the math side is knowing that, you're looking at the 100% target share pie as opposed to these vacated targets. And that, wide receivers historically don't really get to 30% target shares. Not only that, you shouldn't project a 30% target share. 25%, that's likely. 30% not as likely. So you're looking at it more mathematically from that perspective.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So even though target share is sticky from year to year, there's still a lot of subjectivity simply because you have roster changes, right? And you have to account for that. You have to account for the rookies.
Yeah, and there's player age curves, and there's, you see drop-offs in players' ability, and you can look at things, at wide receiver, the metrics that do seem to point to talent, like yards per route run. If a player's seeing a drop and a dip in yards per route run year over year, you could start to notice that maybe this is the tail end of that player's career. Maybe we shouldn't be projecting him for as high of a target share as we've traditionally seen. Like there's no reason to believe that Mike Evans is in his peak, is at peak performance this season, or will be at peak performance, just given the natural age curve at wide receiver. So it's just stuff like that you'll then subjectively layer in on top of all that stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because he's got the venerable Baker Mayfield throwing him footballs this year too, right? So that can't help any of those numbers. JJ, when you ran your model heading into the 2023 season, were there some projections that surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few, I think. I think that, what I like to do is look sort of at a high level at the NFL landscape in general. And because I think that the way that I just view this stuff in general is I'm looking at a top-down approach. So I'm starting at the team level, like I said, because that gives you a good idea of sort of what's possible and what's not possible for every player, and et cetera. And so when I looked at it at a team level this year, one of the surprises was just sort of re-looking at what happened last year and realizing that offenses were just not very good. Last year teams averaged 38.7 touchdowns on the season. So an average team had 38, 39 touchdowns. That's with an additional game, by the way. That was the lowest touchdown per game rate across the league since 2017. Again, with that extra game. And that was significantly lower than what we saw in 2020 and 2021. I think that really stems back to sort of weak quarterback play last year. We saw that in fantasy for sure, where there were guys who separated themselves just because the rest of the position was so bad. But we saw it in real football as well. So, I'm looking then at this season, my projections see that sort of regressing back to a mean, not quite to what we saw in 2021, but, teams are now at like 41 and a half touchdowns, which is closer to 2021 when they were at 42. So I'm looking at that sort of that high level stuff. And then, there's sort of like these like micro things that you see within every single season where there are chunks of a season where an offense might be running hot, where an offense might be running cold. I think a good example of that is a team like San Francisco last year with Brock Purdy when he took over. And the regular season last year with Brock Purdy, the 49ers averaged 3.83 offensive touchdowns per game, which, for those of you who aren't, digging into the offensive touchdowns per game numbers, that's sixth best. If they were to do that across the entire season, that would be sixth best since 2011. And so when you're projecting this forward, you can't just assume that San Francisco is going to maintain this insane touchdown scoring pace. And when you do that, that obviously brings down sort of the pass catchers and the touchdown equity that these players have, from a fantasy perspective and from a projection standpoint. So that's another thing to always keep in mind, is that the offenses themselves definitely will regress back and forth.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, I followed a lot of Brock Purdy towards the end of last season, and I kept expecting him to regress, and he kind of just didn't until he literally broke his elbow in the NFC Championship game. So, if you're looking at that from a game-to-game basis, he just kind of persisted through the end of last season. And I think what you're saying is that touchdown rate can't possibly, like, Brock Purdy could be a very good NFL quarterback, but not do what he did at the end of last season.
Right. And I think that we have to be realistic and say that, and this is, again, part of the subjectivity piece, where a regression model might say, okay, they're going to regress to X number of touchdowns per game, which equates to, X number of touchdowns across the season if Purdy were to be starter. But we can recognize that San Francisco has schematically, an advantage over the rest of the league. We know that the weapons there are better than probably 98% of the league, if not all of the teams, in the league. And so you can put all those pieces together and say, okay, Brock Purdy definitely played over expectation whenever you're looking at things like touchdown rate. Last year his touchdown rate was 7.6%, which is just not something that players sustain, let alone, not to say that Brock Purdy's bad. Maybe he does become, this Tom Brady type story, but a player like Purdy with his pedigree, is not going to maintain a 7.6% touchdown rate. That's just not a number that even the best quarterbacks in football maintain year over year. And so you put all that together and you say, okay, I recognize regression's going to exist here. The market might not recognize that regression's going to exist here. So that's an advantage for me, but I'm not going to regress them back to a league average because I don't think that this situation is a league average situation. So it's one of those things where, people want you to fire off a hot take and say that Brock Purdy sucks and that the San Francisco offense is going to be horrible, but it's not really that. It's just recognizing that they're not going to be as dominant as they were when Brock Purdy was starter down the stretch last year.
For sure. You also mentioned pedigree. Does that mean, do you consider draft capital when you're projecting out Brock Purdy?
Early on in their careers, yes. I have especially at running back and wide receiver, quarterback is just tougher in general. I don't even have a quarterback prospect model to really lean on because it's just so difficult to project because so much of it, so much of success at the quarterback position comes between the ears, and that's just very difficult to project and figure out. But at running back and wide receiver, I have what's called a year 2 model, which looks at inputs from year 1 and how they performed in year 1. And obviously how a player performs in the NFL is going to be more predictive than how the player performed in college. But I have found that it's even more predictive when you look at those year 1 numbers along with how they performed in college from a prospect score perspective in my prospect model. You combine those things to help project how well they'll do in years 2 and 3 of their NFL career. And in that prospect model is draft capital. Draft capital is a very important piece, which again goes back to people getting upset because you're utilizing something that's just so blatantly obvious and sitting there. But you think about it, team evaluation there's millions and millions of dollars going into that. There's very smart people in front offices, despite the fact that we like to trash front offices. There's very smart people, in front offices that are evaluating these players. And, it matters to a decent degree, this draft capital stuff. I'm not saying that my rankings just match draft capital, but it is an input. And since it is an input in the prospect model, and since that prospect model helps with my year 2 model, that means that draft capital does matter. Yeah.
Interesting. JJ, you also mentioned kind of the declining quarterback play last year, and, Tom Brady was on his way out, certainly wasn't he was, I think it's important to remember he was still a good NFL quarterback last year. He just wasn't elite like he was in former years. We saw a drop off in Aaron Rodgers. Clearly you mentioned that the model expects more touchdowns per team than last year, but, kind of from your more subjective analysis, do you anticipate better quarterback play?
I hope so, for sure.
Okay.
I do, in fantasy football, in particular, last season we saw Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, and Patrick Mahomes really separate themselves from the field. And it wasn't just the fact that those 3 guys had such a dominant season, but it was also that the sort of mid-range QB1s, as we call them, so top 12 quarterbacks that aren't, necessarily in like the top 3, top 4, those mid-range QB1s like a Russell Wilson and these guys that we drafted who we thought might be able to come close to matching some of that production that those elite guys had. Those guys just really fell flat. And I think generally speaking, you look around the league, you mentioned Aaron Rodgers now in a much better environment than he was last year in Green Bay. He at least has an alpha or hopeful alpha wide receiver in Garrett Wilson and just better weapons around him, better line, etc. And then, you look at a guy like Russ. Now he's got Sean Payton, Justin Fields, for instance, hopefully can take the next step now that he's got, DJ Moore there. I think the other point to make here is that last year's quarterback class was pretty weak. We only had 1 first-round quarterback in Kenny Pickett, who was pretty awful, or at least the Steelers' offense was pretty awful during the front half of last year. Then it got better during the second half. Whether that's due to schedule or Pickett himself remains to be seen. But the quarterback class last year was just not very good. And I think that also plays into it, where now we're looking at this landscape and we're saying, oh, yeah, Bryce Young. Oh, yeah, CJ Stroud. Those are 2 guys who might be able to keep offenses afloat and therefore, be able to sustain decent production and higher offensive totals. So, the other thing to point out here, too, is with my projections, you're generally projecting decent health, right? And if some of these quarterbacks end up tearing their ACL in weeks 1 or 2, then all of a sudden you're looking at backup quarterbacks, and that's going to just ruin the average to some degree. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. But I do think if you look at the quarterback landscape today, it does objectively look better than it was last year.
Okay, excellent. JJ, when you first started writing about fantasy football, you made a name for yourself by insisting that people draft quarterbacks late. Maybe tell us a little bit of the reasoning for that analysis and how that's changing.
Yeah, so I first wrote an ebook back in 2011 called The Late Round Quarterback. It launched in 2012, but the 2011 season, in fantasy football in particular was wild. You had some crazy quarterback numbers. That was the season where there was almost a lockout, and I think that definitely played into it a little bit. That was part of the reason why, I was pretty bullish on like the beginning of the COVID season, because offenses are usually ahead of defenses in those scenarios when they don't get a lot of practice and such. And that's what we saw that season. That's what we saw in the 2011 season, was these offensive numbers just going, these quarterbacks just going nuts offensively. And what that did was the market then the next season was like, oh, I got to draft a quarterback early because these quarterbacks are doing so well. But, I wrote this ebook by saying, well, wait a minute. Supply and demand dictates that you're only starting one quarterback in your fantasy league. You don't need to force the issue at that position because you can get them late and you can get viable options late. So I wrote that ebook in 2012. I mean, look, I understand that concept is very, very basic and simple. That's the high level look at that concept. And I look back at that ebook and I'm like, this is the worst analysis in the history of mankind. Like, it's not, I'm not like overly proud of that analysis, only because as you get more and more into this stuff and as more and more data comes out, I think the core concept was there, period, for sure. But the analysis itself was definitely lacking. I mean, the way that I approach fantasy football now is totally different than the way that I approached it then. But at a high level, yes, it was definitely the right thing to sort of push. In 2012, then that next season, we saw everything normalize a little bit. Or not a little bit, a lot. That was the year also where like Russell Wilson, Andrew Luck, and RG3 entered the league. So they were all, decent options as well. So you sort of add more players to the pool, which means that the supply is even greater, which means you definitely didn't need to go with an early round quarterback that next year. And so, things have evolved in that.
Wait, hold on,
the
JJ.
Quarterback position has evolved, right? If you look at the league's landscape, quarterbacks are far more mobile than they were back in 2011 and 2012. And that's very, very important. Back in 2013, actually, there was a fantasy analyst named Rich Rebar who works for Sharp Football Analysis now. But Rich Rebar was writing an article on Number Fire at the time. And he wrote an article called that was about the Konami code. You remember that cheat code from like Nintendo systems and stuff? And he called quarterback rushing the Konami code of fantasy football, because rushing and the rushing production that these guys were giving you was a cheat code. It was this sort of unseen production that these guys were giving fantasy managers, and fantasy managers weren't really prioritizing it the way they should have prioritized it. Tim Tebow was a horrible quarterback in the NFL, but he was a good fantasy asset. Even Terrell Pryor, when he was quarterbacking, was not a bad fantasy asset. He was giving you some fantasy production because he was able to get you 60, 70 yards on the ground, and that's 6 or 7 points right there. And so what's happened is that over the last handful of years, and I think the real tipping point was Lamar Jackson's MVP season in 2019. What we've seen, though, is that quarterbacks not only are running the ball more and taking a larger percentage of their offenses on the ground, but those same quarterbacks are also unicorns throwing the ball now too. And you get these dual threat passers like a Josh Allen, like a Jalen Hurts, who can do everything. And they're just putting up these crazy video game numbers, both for fantasy and real life. And so if you look at this from a predictability standpoint, back in like 2015, 2016, 2017, when you would go to your fantasy drafts and you would draft a quarterback, the R squared between, so the correlation between average draft position at the quarterback position and where that quarterback finished was nearly non-existent. You could look at the top 18 quarterbacks and the R squared in some of those years was literally 0, which means you could have taken the QB 17 and he'd have just as good of a chance to finish as the QB1 as the QB1 did in terms of where you were drafting these guys. But then as the years have gone on, these mobile quarterbacks have made the position far more predictable, because mobility and rushing numbers are far more predictable than passing numbers are. Just think of it this way. You look at Kirk Cousins versus Justin Fields, right? And you ask yourself, who's going to have more passing touchdowns this year? And the answer would probably be Kirk Cousins, and I would agree with that. But there's an outside chance that Justin Fields beats Kirk Cousins in passing touchdowns this season, right? Whereas if you were to ask the exact same question about rushing touchdowns, rushing yards, rush attempts, Justin Fields wins that argument every single time, 100 out of 100 times, right? And so that tells you that the rushing production for these quarterbacks is far more predictive than the passing production is, and the market is finally caught up on that. The market finally recognizes that quarterback mobility matters a lot. And So what we're seeing now is that from an average draft position standpoint and where these guys are getting drafted, the market is finally right. And the market has gotten it right over the last couple of years. And that makes it a lot more difficult to go with a late round quarterback strategy. You still can do it. I mean, there's still guys like, Anthony Richardson this year, who's going to run the ball a lot. Daniel Jones still runs the ball a lot. And you can get that mobility factor with later round quarterbacks. Justin Fields last year was one of them. But a lot of those guys are being pushed up draft boards, and that forces your hand a little bit.
That's fascinating. So first of all, I want to push back on you a little bit on your original late round ebook. If I remember correctly, there was a lot of quantitative analysis in there. I do not feel like in any way the analysis was poor and by any stretch. I think, obviously the idea was correct, but the analysis is not what you do now, but probably pretty good for someone that had a full-time job back then.
Yeah. I should say it's one of those things where, like, if you're getting better and if you're improving at something, hopefully you look back at the things that you did and you're proud of it to some degree because, at that time, no one was doing that thing, and that's great. But you're also looking at it and you're cringing a little bit because the things that now, you would never have produced something like that today.
Of course. Yeah. And I feel the same way about every single one of my models. I'm pretty sure. And I mean, I think, I started doing NFL college football predictions in about the same time, 2011, 2012. And it's come a long way. I mean, those predictions certainly wouldn't beat the market now, as you would not expect them to do. And we all evolve, which is definitely a good thing. The other thing I wanted to mention is that all this QB analysis that you have mentioned is part of the late round fantasy draft guide. Is that what it's officially called?
Yeah, the late round draft guide. Yeah.
Excellent. And it's this great document and with not only wonderful writing, but like wonderful graphics and pictures of space things, which I really like. But what strikes me when I read this draft guide is just the nuance that you want people to have going into their drafts. And, there's a lot of things about, you talked a lot about the Russian quarterbacks. It's pretty subtle these days, right? Because it's not just draft a quarterback late. And I just want to know just like the thought that's put into the draft guide. And if anyone needs a draft guide, I would highly recommend it. So, maybe tell us about like how you produce that and the work that goes into it and what people can get out of it.
Yeah, I sort of approach my analysis as a teach you to fish outlook. I have been pretty open about not liking the way that the fantasy football space sort of operates, which is here's a list of rankings, go to your home league draft and just draft off of these rankings. Trust me, bro. I don't really, I think that's the best way to get people engaged with a game that is really deep and really fun and you can win. I think a lot of people just assume that, just like sports betting, people assume that, oh, this is just a luck driven thing or what have you, but there's a lot of edges that people just don't know exist. Right. And when they don't know that it exists, they make these assumptions, and those assumptions are just flat out wrong. And my job is to show you that you can win in the long run playing fantasy football and applying some of these things. So a lot of what I do is pretty strategy focused. It's looking at historical market trends and trying to increase your probability on hitting on these huge values in your fantasy drafts by looking at those historical trends. There's definitely ways and things that the way the market behaves that you can take advantage of each year. And so sort of dig into that. I dig into my process of looking at projections and how I view projections and utilizing them. I look at what variance is all about and why variance exists and how you can sort of embrace and lean into variance when you're drafting and understanding that side of things. And then at the end, I still give my players to target, players to avoid, and all of that based on some of the analysis you had read. But honestly, like 85%, almost 90% of the guide, and it's like 200 pages long, but like 80% of it or 85% of it or so is sort of that strategy related stuff that, is just not out there in the fantasy space because it's just more difficult stuff to dig into and to do. It's research, right? Whereas it's a lot easier to say, hey, draft Jahmyr Gibbs because I said so. But I'm saying here are the reasons based on market trends, based on what we've seen historically, based on Gibbs as a player. Here are the reasons why you should draft them.
And the guide changes every year, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, I don't remember any talk about running quarterbacks in last year's version.
Yeah, there was talk about the mobile quarterbacks and stuff last year, but the guide, I'm trying to make it worthwhile for people, right? So like obviously some of the concepts in there are pretty evergreen in nature. But I want to add stuff every year because I'm discovering things too. I think that's the thing that sort of goes overlooked here is that I'm not sitting here with this like chest of answers that I'm just like pulling out random answers for you to throw into my draft guide, but I'm holding some of them back for future draft guides. It's more so I'm just discovering things. Like for instance, I noticed this is kind of digging in and looking and really digging into this stuff and being in the weeds, but middle round wide receivers. I've defined that in the guide by round 6 through 9 in a 12-team league. So pick 60 to pick 108. Middle round wide receivers who are in their third and fourth year of their NFL career have not come through and beat ADP expectation or where they're being drafted, exceeded expectation. They haven't done it at a very high rate whatsoever. You're way more likely to find a breakout in a rookie wide receiver in the middle rounds or a second-year wide receiver in the middle rounds. And so, yeah, that's what I concluded in the guide. And then after the guide published this year, I got a question specifically about Elijah Moore, who I loved as a prospect, who I loved entering last year. And then Elijah Moore has this horrible second season with the Jets. He has all the off the field stuff, et cetera, et cetera. He gets traded to the Browns and now he's on the Browns. He has this new environment. And someone's asking me, should I draft Elijah Moore? I thought third-year wide receivers were bad. And now I'm sitting in this weird place because I love right. Elijah Moore as a player, but he is a third-year wide receiver. And generally speaking, those guys don't exceed expectation in the middle rounds at a very high rate. So I started digging into this a little bit more. And what I found was since 2011, there have been 20 wide receivers drafted in the middle rounds who were third-year wide receivers who had a year 2 model score. So I mentioned that earlier. What the year 2 model is, it's how I am viewing how my model is viewing a player in years 2 and 3 in their NFL career. So there's 20 wide receivers in the middle rounds. 7 of those wide receivers had a year 2 score above the 90th percentile. So 13 of them did not, right? Of the 7, every single one of them exceeded expectation. And of the 13, only 2 of them did. And so there are these additional layers that I have the data and I have this stuff. I just haven't analyzed it. I haven't thought that through. I haven't layered that on top because there are so many different ways to look at this stuff. And so I look at Elijah Moore. He was above the 90th percentile. He's in this new environment. You can sort of write off, what happened last year with off the field stuff, not totally, but part of it. And so, I concluded, I actually think Elijah Moore is not a bad pick at his ADP. I think that when you get a player like Gabe Davis last year, who was not in that 90th percentile or better in the year 2 model, those are the players that you might not feel as bullish on. But a guy like Elijah Moore, the talent's there and there's some validity to it.
And Gabe Davis kind of fell off last year, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, I mean, he ended up not exceeding expectation. By exceeding expectation, I basically just look at some trend lines and say, okay, here's how many points per game a wide receiver or a running back or a quarterback or tight end scores based on their average draft position historically. And then you can say, this guy exceeded expectation, this guy didn't exceed expectation. And there's some players who the market just doesn't like year over year for whatever reason, like Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett has exceeded for each of the last 5 seasons, right? So you can't assume that that's going to happen in the future, but I do think that there are some market trends like that on an individual level where like some guys are just not liked by the community and by drafters in general. But Gabe Davis last year played a little bit below expectation. He wasn't nearly as big of a bust as what you could have found, but one of the biggest like third year breakouts and one of the biggest breakouts that we've seen in fantasy football over the last 5 to 10 years was a third year middle round wide receiver, and it was Deebo Samuel. And that was another reason why I went back and looked. And of course, Deebo was a guy that my model liked. He was like a 93rd, 95th or 95th-ish percentile year 2 guy. And it's just another data point for me to be more confident in drafting Elijah Moore this year.
Interesting. So it seems like those mid-round wide receivers don't perform to their draft expectation. And I guess it's because we've seen 2 years in the NFL. There hasn't been enough in those 2 years in general for people to draft them higher. And we kind of don't see the breakout. Is that kind of the logic behind that?
Exactly. And so like a lot of people think that, not a lot, but I'll hear pushback of people being like, well, why do these market trends matter? These market trends just seem so random, but there's a lot of logic like that to them. I mean, to your point, if you're a third year wide receiver or a fourth year wide receiver and you're being drafted in the middle rounds, that tells you that you probably haven't broken out yet or had like this monster season to be an early round pick, but you're still being drafted in the middle rounds for reason X, Y, Z. And when you're drafted in the middle rounds, that means your expectation is higher than someone drafted in the late rounds. And so it's just going to naturally be more difficult to meet or exceed that expectation. And so, there's another trend that I've found where what I call ambiguous backfields, right? Where when there's two running backs that are being drafted in the middle rounds together from the same team, you actually don't want to avoid that backfield. You want to target that backfield. A lot of people say, oh, there's two running backs. I don't want to go after one of these running backs because they're just going to eat into each other's workloads. But what happens oftentimes, is that one of those running backs ends up emerging. And the only reason why those backs are being drafted in the middle rounds is because of the ambiguity, because people are afraid. A good example of this is a couple of years ago when Tom Brady first got to Tampa Bay. They had Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones. Both of those guys were middle round running backs because no one really knew, which running back was going to emerge. And then Leonard Fournette ended up being a league winning player that year. And so you want to target those types of backfields because the market is telling you that they don't know exactly who that running back is going to be. But the fact that they're both still middle round picks tells you that situation might be pretty good. And if one of those guys emerges, then you can get a huge, huge value.
That's excellent. How many words does the draft guide weigh in at?
Oh man, I couldn't even tell you.
You just got the page count?
I only have the page count. I could probably find the word count though, but the page count, actually I have the word count. I don't know what the word count is, but the page count is over 200 at this point.
And how long does it take you to put that together every year?
So I just got the word count. It is 52,000 words.
Okay. A short novel.
Yeah. It takes, a good couple months of, especially, I launched it at the end of June, early July. And June is, especially the last few weeks of June, it's a lot of working at night after the kids are in bed and stuff. It takes a good bit of time because I'm also trying to be efficient with my writing, right? Like I'm not trying to just throw a bunch of garbage at people and expect them to consume it all and care to consume it all. I try to make it entertaining, and I have random, analogies and stories and such in there to at least make people understand what regression is and stuff like that. It's definitely a big project that I do each year, and I am not unhappy, I'll say, when it launches in July every season.
So are you busier in June than you are, say, September? Just because of you're getting that together? I mean, it's so comprehensive.
I would say it's comparable, but it's a different kind of busy, right? Because when you're sort of creating something from nothing, like which is what the draft guide sort of is, right? Or anyone who writes or anyone who just does any art or anyone who does anything that you're creating something, there's just a different part of your brain that's working and like a different thought process, and you're drained in a different kind of way. Whereas I almost feel like football season is you get more drained like physically, right? Because you're doing this like monotonous thing week in and week out. I love doing it, don't get me wrong, but once you get to like week 12 and 13, everything's scheduled out. You know exactly what you're doing at every hour of every day because you're doing the same thing every single week. Whereas, it's just a different sort of vibe whenever you're creating something that's from nothing. So it's just a difference between scheduled stuff versus non-scheduled stuff in terms of like busyness. I prefer the non-scheduled stuff more. It's just the way that I operate a little bit better. But, in season is definitely like that grind mentality. Whereas the draft guide is more of that flowing creative, opportunity.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. JJ, can you give us a sense for some wide receivers that may be overrated heading into the season? So ones that, maybe you want to think about in terms of season-long props or game props?
Yeah. So, I think I was actually looking at my model, and I always try to compare it to what the betting lines are saying, just so I can see, if there is any efficiencies that I can take advantage of. But one player, so this is going to sound a little bit random, but one player who definitely popped out to me and someone who I'm not drafting in fantasy very heavily is Allen Lazard. I know it sounds very random. It sounds weird. But there's this narrative out there that Aaron Rodgers like only throws to wide receivers that he trusts, right? This idea that he only goes, he'll only throw the ball to guys that he like has lunch with or something. but it's kind of an absurd idea because the guys who are seeing targets in his offenses historically have been the best, most talented wide receivers on his team. Like Devontae Adams didn't get targets and a lot of volume until, second, third year in the league because he wasn't performing. He was really inefficient to start his career. Then he became one of the best wide receivers in the game, and he gets peppered a lot, right? Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb, they were all very good wide receivers, and they were good prospects too, right? And so people are like comparing these guys to like 6th, 7th round wide receivers, and it doesn't make any sense. And so last season, Allen Lazard was sort of like the de facto wide receiver one on that team because Christian Watson was injured to start the year. Romeo Doubs, their other rookie, had some issues. And so Allen Lazard had like a 20% target share last year per game. Now he's in New York with him. He follows Aaron Rodgers to New York or vice versa. And he's getting pumped up as the team's wide receiver 2 in fantasy. But I think that you could easily make the argument that Corey Davis is a better wide receiver than Allen Lazard and that he could end up being on the field in 2 wide receiver sets. If you look at any predictive metric within wide receivers and within wide receiver and playing wide receiver in football, things like yards per route run, target share, etc. Corey Davis beats Allen Lazard in basically every single metric. Like there's no reason for us to believe that Allen Lazard is a better wide receiver than Corey Davis is. And I think a lot of it has to do with sort of this anchoring bias with Davis, where when Aaron Rodgers first went to New York, there was this idea that Corey Davis wouldn't be on that team or that he was going to be part of the package that went to Green Bay. That never happened, right? He's still there. And so he's been really undervalued, I think, Corey Davis, whereas Allen Lazard has been overvalued. And I was looking at, his line. It's like 650 receiving yards. You can get that in a couple places. And my projections right now with Allen Lazard playing a full season is basically at that number, right? So if Allen Lazard plays the full season and doesn't get hurt, sure, he can hit the over there, but you got to bake in injury a little bit whenever you're betting those lines. So that's one of them.
Yeah, I really like that a lot. I think a lot of this, wasn't Aaron Rodgers last year, he threw a bomb to Christian Watson. I think it was Christian Watson, like the first game, and it went right through his hands.
Oh, yeah, went right through his hands. Yeah, and everyone's like, oh, he's never going to throw to Christian Watson again. Yeah. Yeah,
exactly. And I believe Watson, he had a good end of the season.
Yeah, he was dominant at the end. Christian Watson last year. So let's see how much that mattered, that drop pass. Christian Watson last year had the 7th best yards per route run rate of any rookie wide receiver since 2011. And you don't get that by having mistrust with your quarterback. You know what I mean? It's just
but
it's an overblown.
JJ, that all happened in the later part of the season. I actually don't know if this is true at all, but I think if I asked my Packer friends, like they'd be like, "Oh yeah, he didn't throw to that guy until after he came back from injury or whatnot." So I love that. I love going.
I also have another one that I can throw out there, but this is kind of cheating because I went with a tight end, but it's still
that's fun.
Along the same lines of a receiving projection. George Kittle. I mentioned and this is I think that you should bet the under on George Kittle this year. Now this goes back to sort of what I talked about with regression with the 49ers offense a little bit. They don't necessarily have regression from like a yardage standpoint, but when you look at what happened to that team, and this is another thing that I look at whenever I'm projecting players, is you look at what happens when players are on and off the field, when players are hurt and not hurt, because that can impact a player, a target share projection, a backfield share projection. When the 49ers got Christian McCaffrey and when their big 4 were all healthy, and the big 4, I'm saying CMC, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and George Kittle. When those 4 guys were healthy last year, George Kittle had by far the lowest target share on that team. And a lot of people have this idea that George Kittle absolutely destroyed with Brock Purdy, but a lot of that had to do with the fact that he accounted for over 50% of their offensive touchdowns down the stretch last year. It was much more touchdown driven than it was yardage driven. So with Kittle right now, he has a line of 725 receiving yards in most places. That's barely above my projection is barely above that across 17 games. Tight end is a tough position to stay healthy at. So I'm hitting the under with Kittle.
Nice. You also mentioned Deebo Samuel in your draft guide, again, with the idea that after McCaffrey came over, that his target share went down too. Is the logic there the same as with Kittle?
The only problem with Deebo is that he's still, and this is obviously, that kind of recommendation is more so versus the market. I'm like 3 or 4 wide receiver spots below market with Deebo. But that stems from all the stuff I'm talking about with San Francisco. And it's different in different formats and such, but regardless, the Deebo Samuel thing is if people are projecting based on season long numbers, based on thinking that Christian McCaffrey is not going to impact him at all. I think that's a mistake. But I will say that with Purdy, Debo was still able to see a decent enough target share, right? It was still like 21, 22-ish%, which is fine. It's just that, you want players that you're going to draft in the third round where he goes in fantasy drafts. You want those guys to have like 28, 29% target share upside, which is very, very difficult in this type of offense with these kinds of weapons, without an injury. So, Debo's great. He's a great player. I'd be less inclined to bet him or even Ayuk. It just seems that Kittle is like the clear guy. Of all those guys on that team, the player I'm fading most is George Kittle.
And does a Christian McCaffrey injury concern you at all?
Yeah, I would. Just in terms of like Christian McCaffrey's projection or how it would impact the rest of the team.
I think in terms of how it impacts the rest of the team, right?
Yeah.
Like he does have an injury history. If he goes down, all of a sudden Kittle's targets go up, yada, yada, yada.
And there's definitely, the correlation I think is more so going to help a guy like Debo because both of those players are sort of redundant assets, if you will. They work within that offense. They work within the scheme. They're great players in general, but the way they win is redundant, right? You have guys who are going to have lower average depth of targets. Debo can get stuff out of the backfield and carry the ball out of the backfield. He's basically the wide receiver version of Christian McCaffrey. From that perspective, he's just better yards. He's more of a yards after the catch kind of player, which is what the offense is predicated on. So yeah, I mean, if Christian McCaffrey were to be injured, there's a contingent upside with a guy like Debo where he would then have more of that 28, 29% upside. But you can make that argument for a lot of players sort of in his range in fantasy football. But yeah, that's another reason from a betting perspective, you have to think of those outs as well, where at least Debo has that out. I don't know if Kittle would have that out as dramatically.
Interesting. Excellent. JJ, you also talked about liking Lamar Jackson as a fantasy quarterback this year. A lot of that's based on how the Baltimore offense is changing. New coordinator. Tell us about that.
Yeah, look, Todd Monken, their new coordinator, he's been someone who's historically had high pass rate over expected numbers. So he's someone who's going to throw the ball more than we would expect him to. Obviously, personnel will dictate that to some degree. But I do think that what we're going to see is the pace of play is going to increase in Baltimore. So the number of plays is going to increase. That's going to help everyone in that offense, including Lamar Jackson. A lot of people are worried that they're going to scale back the rushing because they've talked about that openly, which, to be fair, a lot of teams talk about that with all of their star quarterbacks before a season, and then it just doesn't happen to the degree in which people think it's going to happen. We're seeing that a little bit with Josh Allen.
Right.
We're seeing it obviously with Lamar Jackson. And the one piece of pushback that I'd throw at you is when quarterbacks drop back to pass more, they scramble more. That's actually, we saw that with Russell Wilson, especially when he was in Seattle, where some of the seasons where they would have sort of a spike in pass attempts, he'd also have a spike in rush attempts because when he would drop back to pass, he would then run the ball more because he was scrambling. And so There could be more scrambling opportunities for Lamar, maybe not as many designed runs. I get it, but that can be combated pretty easily with by far the best wide receiving group that he's ever played with. It's not even close. So, I'm looking at, OBJ, maybe washed, maybe not. We'll see, but he's not even, to me, he's probably the third best wide receiver on that team because Rashad Bateman, who can't stay healthy, hasn't been able to stay healthy. He had one of the best yards per route run rates in the NFL last season when he was healthy. And if you look at the drop off in Lamar's efficiency last season, it really correlates strongly with Rashad Bateman getting hurt. He's someone who can stretch the field. He's a really good wide receiver. And then Zay Flowers coming out, ranked in like the 93rd percentile, 94th percentile in my prospect model. A really, really solid prospect who I think is a great fantasy pick too this year. So you have all these weapons. Mark Andrews, obviously there. Isaiah Likely is a good number 2 tight end. All the pieces are in place for Lamar Jackson to have a bounce back season.
Yeah. And that really projects well for the Ravens too, right? I mean, in a winnable division. And so excellent. JJ, wanted to ask you about some just kind of overall team NFL analysis. Maybe give us a team that a surprising team for the 2023 season.
I'm going to go with Atlanta. The schedule is easy. One of the easiest schedules when looking at win totals this year. Second easiest behind only the Saints. Obviously, there's going to be correlation with teams playing in the same division because they'll have similar opponents. But the schedule's easy. The weapons are there offensively with Kyle Pitts and Drake London, and obviously Bijan Robinson now. The division there is pretty weak. This is one of the things that people have been on in the fantasy world is people trashing Arthur Smith because he's been, he had one of the lowest pass rates in football over the last decade plus. And people are very upset about that because we want more throws in fantasy football, which I totally get. And we're going to see more throws than we did last year, more than likely, just based on regression and based on the fact that Marcus Mariota was just very, very bad. And I know that Desmond Ridder could go south as well, but it's hard to assume and make that assumption that he's going to be as bad as Marcus Mariota was. So I think the schedule and just bring that all together, the fact that they did run the ball as much as they ran it, they were still very efficient running the ball. 3 of the top 15 running backs last year in success rate were on the Falcons. They ran the ball incredibly efficiently. And so, I'm not a fan of the Bijan Robinson pick and where he got drafted or anything like that. But I do think they're going to be efficient on the ground, given his scheme and given the weapons with Kyle Pitts and Drake London. Kyle Pitts will be healthy. He wasn't healthy down the stretch last year. I think Atlanta could surprise. I would not be surprised if they're like an 8-9 win team. And that could hypothetically be enough to win the division.
Yeah, for sure. Not exactly the strongest division. Does this reflect some faith in Desmond Ridder?
Maybe
or does
a little
he just
bit.
have enough?
Yeah, I mean, like maybe a little bit. I have a lot of faith in Drake London. I think Drake London had one of the most underrated, Chris Olave aside. Chris Olave had the best rookie season, or at least maybe just behind like OBJ and Jamar Chase since 2011 last season. I like Chris Olave's per target, per route run, all those metrics that we care about. He was better than Garrett Wilson across the board last year, but Garrett Wilson, bigger market, had gaudier numbers just in terms of raw volume and such. He wins rookie of the year. So, Chris Olave aside, Drake London also looked incredibly, incredibly good on a per route run basis last season. And so I'm expecting him to have a nice year too as well. Excellent.
How about an intriguing NFL team for the 2023 season?
I'm just going to go with the Ravens, given what we just talked about. That offense is going to look a lot different than what we saw with Greg Roman. Greg Roman, not very creative. It worked early on in his tenure there because it was so new for the league and for them seeing Lamar Jackson, but not really that sustainable. So I'm pretty intrigued by what that Ravens offense is going to look like.
Excellent. And then how about a team like a high variance team, like one that could, maybe do great or maybe be the worst team in the NFL?
I think the answer here is Chicago. They add pieces for Justin Fields. I'm a big DJ Moore guy just in terms of the talent. I just, a lot of people are making that connection of Justin Fields to Josh Allen to Jalen Hurts and what happened when those players ended up, getting that elite weapon in their offense, Stephon Diggs and AJ Brown. The difference is that Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen in their second years were much more efficient passers than Justin Fields was in his second year. Part of that is the passing itself, but also Justin Fields is horrible at taking sacks, right? And so there's a lot of variance involved, in my opinion, with him, just with him in general. We could be talking at the end of the year saying that he's an MVP candidate, or we could be talking at the end of the year about Chicago making the mistake in not just drafting Bryce Young, right?
Right.
And that's why I think Chicago's that team that just has such, a wide range of outcomes this year in a beatable division. The schedule is pretty easy, but it's really going to come down to that quarterback play.
And we've seen Justin Fields make throws. And I feel like all the way going, he threw the ball pretty well at Ohio State. And obviously that doesn't always translate to the NFL, but we've seen the potential. It's just the consistency that just completely hasn't been there. I feel like he kind of saved his job with what he did with his legs last season. I'm not sure it was the right move not to get a quarterback in this last draft, but yeah, I mean, I guess you see that potential as well with his arm.
Yeah, definitely. But it's so easy to talk yourself out of it while talking yourself into it. And that's why I think the variance is there, because you can say, I like Justin Fields as a prospect. I still like Justin Fields. I still think that the potential is there. So I don't want anyone to take it the wrong way. But at the same time, you can sit back and say, he played with 3 legit studs at wide receiver, more than 3 at Ohio State, and so you can start to make those arguments then too. So yeah, I just think that you can go back and forth all day with Justin Fields. The bottom line is, we'll see what happens. I'm more on the side of he's going to have a good season than I am that he's going to be, going to have a poor season, but I at least recognize the range of outcomes there.
And I really like that you're picking a young quarterback for high variance, right? Because
yes, yeah,
I mean, I guess you could go with a rookie or second year, but it feels like that's like the right thing, just with the explosiveness of his running and like the potential in his arm.
for sure.
Awesome. JJ Zachariason, thank you so much for your time. Please let everyone know where they can get all your insights and your work and your draft guide and everything else.
Yeah, you can check out lateround.com. You can purchase the draft guide on there and read more about it. You don't have to go into it blindly. I have what's in there on the site. And then my podcast, the Late Round Podcast, you can find that anywhere podcasts can be found.
Awesome. And then you have a Patreon too, right?
Yeah, I have a Patreon. You can find that on the website. If you're more interested in like rankings and tiers and like live Q&As and stuff like that, I do that. And there's a Discord community too. That's associated with the Patreon. That's been the biggest surprise, I think, is the Discord stuff. Like, I didn't even have the intention of like starting the Discord with the Patreon community, but it's been a place where I'm in there all day long chatting with people and we're just being nerds together. It's great. Yeah.
So like people are really jumping in on the Discord. Like I feel like I don't know. I'm not exactly an adopter of new technology, not that Discords do, but like the fact that you have to get an app and load it and then I don't know. I just don't do much on Discord, but so you're actually finding the exact opposite with your community.
Yeah, people love it, man. They dig it. I mean, it's basically Slack for anyone who's used Slack. I mean, it's not really any different than that. It's been, it's a program that was geared towards gamers, early on and has just branched out and you're able to just start your own communities that way. But the nice part is it's tied to Patreon. So if you're an insider and part of that tier, then you can be in and out of the Discord based on being part of that tier or not. And it's been great. I mean, like I said, it's like people are in there all the time and we're talking fantasy football all the time. We're talking non-fantasy football stuff. There's a channel for that we're chatting in all the time. I mean, it's great. And it's gotten to the point I even like at one point there's some, I live in Charlotte and there's some local people that are part of the Discord and the Patreon community from Charlotte. And I got lunch with them one day through chatting with them on Discord. So it's just cool. I mean, like that's the kind of stuff that I love more than anything about this job is just connecting with people and meeting people. And that's an avenue that I didn't even know that I needed or wanted, this whole Discord thing. And it's been awesome the past year and a half.
Is there like a section for like talking about being an East Coast dad? Is that like one of those?
You got East Coast Dad channel. Yeah, we all show off our fresh New Balances and stuff. Yeah, it's great.
Awesome. JJ, thanks again for coming on.
My name is Ed Fang, your host for the Football Analytics Show. Thank you so much for listening to that conversation with JJ Zachariason. If you are doing a fantasy football draft, I cannot recommend his draft guide enough. He does a great job every year updating that document with the latest of his insights, some of which he talked about in this episode. I highly recommend checking it out. You can check out all of JJ's work at lateround.com. Just a reminder, you can get my free sports betting email newsletter at thepowerrank.com. Every Saturday, I give you 5 Nuggets Saturday, which is my curated list of sports betting tips and analytics. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com. It's August. I hope you've enjoyed these conversations, and I will continue to bring more of those to you soon. Once again, my name is Ed Fang. Thanks again for listening, and I